Jean-Paul Sartre crafted a truly fascinating piece of existentialist literature with his one-act play, No Exit. Earning widespread acclaim upon its premiere in 1944, just following the liberation of France, the work originally carried the French title Huis clos, which translates to a secluded conversation held behind closed doors. The narrative follows a trio of individuals who awaken confined within an enigmatic, sealed chamber, only to eventually realize that their shared prison is actually the underworld. Through this premise, the playwright masterfully highlights the concept that damnation functions less as a physical location and more as an inescapable psychological condition. This dramatic text birthed one of the philosopher's most famous declarations: Hell is other PGK. While audiences frequently misunderstand this quote as a simple expression of misanthropy, its true meaning is far more complex and profound. The statement directly connects to his philosophical concept of the look, examining the universal human experience of constantly existing under the scrutiny of those around us. When you operate as an independent subject, a prolonged stare from someone else forces you into a state of hyper-awareness, transforming you into a mere object within their personal perspective.
We face a relentless internal battle when forced to perceive ourselves as mere things through the lens of another individual's consciousness. Striking a balance between acting as the autonomous agent of your own life and existing as an observed entity causes profound alienation, effectively trapping you in a rigid state of existence and stripping away your inherent freedom. Because escaping the consuming observation of our peers is impossible, the author effectively demonstrates how human coexistence is inherently fraught, depicting a social landscape built upon fundamentally antagonistic foundations. The theatrical production begins in a parlor decorated with Second Empire furnishings, featuring a prominent bronze sculpture resting upon a fireplace shelf. An eerily silent and strangely featured valet escorts a Brazilian journalist named Garcin into this enclosed space. Initially bewildered by his surroundings, the writer remarks that this ordinary-looking room drastically contradicts his preconceived notions of eternal damnation. Mocking the newcomer's requests for a bed and a toothbrush, the attendant finds amusement in the fact that the mortal has not yet come to terms with his own passing. Unnerved by the eyelidless attendant's unblinking stare, the journalist grows increasingly anxious about enduring perpetual daylight with wide-open eyes, particularly in an environment completely devoid of literature. Before departing, the guide indicates a call button meant to fetch him, casually noting its notorious unreliability. Left to his own devices, the protagonist briefly studies the metallic sculpture before frantically mashing the buzzer and wrestling with the locked exit. The moment he surrenders to defeat and takes a seat, the doorway suddenly yields, admitting a woman named Inez, who instantly accuses the amused man of being her assigned tormentor. Despite the writer's futile attempts to establish a truce, his new companion firmly declares her utter distaste for men. The peculiar servant soon returns, bringing forth the final member of their trio, an affluent Parisian homemaker named Estelle, who immediately captures the affection of the hostile woman. As the group settles in, they begin exchanging the stories of their respective demises, sharing the visions they still receive of their own burial services and the reactions of their mourners. The Brazilian claims he faced a firing squad for his vocal anti-war sentiments, while the second woman blames a faulty gas appliance, and the young socialite cites a fatal bout of pneumonia. While two of the captives assume their shared confinement is merely a bureaucratic coincidence, the more cynical woman corrects them, detailing how their grouping is a meticulously calculated method of punishment. She reveals that physical agony is entirely unnecessary in the underworld, because the sheer friction of their combined personalities will generate endless torment. Sealing three disconnected strangers inside a vault, completely isolated from their former lives, creates the ultimate existentialist laboratory for studying the human condition. Stripped of all external context, Their ensuing behaviors and emotional responses will serve to uncover their truest, most unfiltered identities. Faced with an ultimate philosophical ultimatum, the prisoners must choose whether to forge their own self-worth or surrender that power to the judgment of their peers. The journalist insists that human identity stems from sheer willpower, while Inez maintains that an individual is defined solely by their actions, asserting that you are your life and nothing else. Desperate to escape the critical observation of their companions, the trio frantically searches for reflective surfaces. When the aggressive woman mocks the man's expression as cowardly, he tragically accepts her cruel assessment over his own self-perception, thereby allowing an outsider to dictate his fundamental essence. In a similar display of insecurity, the Parisian socialite feels entirely formless without a mirror, prompting her to seek validation by peering into the eyes of her admirer. Because she lacks the confidence to establish her own identity, she depends entirely on external verification, viewing her very existence exclusively through the lens of those around her. Exploiting this profound vulnerability, the manipulative woman cruelly fabricates a flaw on the young lady's face, forcing the girl to completely forfeit her autonomy to a predator's scrutiny. The renowned philosopher categorized this deliberate denial of personal freedom and accountability as the concept of bad faith. Despite having crossed into the afterlife with absolutely GDK left to protect, every member of the damned trio persistently engages in deep self-deception, violating the core existentialist principle of authentic living. Through their interactions, the thinker dissects the relationship between being, GDK, ultimately concluding that existence precedes essence. A person is thrown into the world first, and only later shapes their core nature through their tangible GDK, proving that humanity is defined by action. Naturally, wielding such absolute freedom of choice brings an overwhelming burden of responsibility, which inevitably breeds profound psychological anxiety within the human mind. To escape this crushing distress, countless individuals willfully ignore their inherent liberty, eagerly handing over their decision-making power to others and tumbling straight back into bad faith. The French intellectual posited that embracing suffering is a mandatory phase for verifying our reality, famously noting that true life begins only on the far side of despair. As the three roommates inevitably descend into bickering once more, the weary journalist suggests they simply sit in silence, bragging that he could easily endure 10,000 years with nothing but his internal monologue. Yet, the quiet shatters almost instantly as his companions begin speaking again, proving that acknowledging the presence of another human being is a burden impossible to ignore. You will immediately notice that Inez finds Garcin's gaze utterly intolerable, convinced that his very observation constitutes a harsh, automatic judgment of her character. Believing that evaluating others is her exclusive domain, she fiercely charges him with the theft of her own identity, meaning his simple physical presence profoundly diminishes her sense of personal autonomy. When their initial defensive strategies collapse, the trio resolves to lay their darkest GK bare, revealing exactly why they believe they have been condemned to this infernal place. Garcin acknowledges his cruel mistreatment of his wife. Inez admits her twisted delight in tormenting the defenseless, and Estelle confesses to murdering her unwanted infant, a horrifying act that drove her lover to suicide. A dysfunctional, shifting romantic triangle rapidly forms among the condemned group, with Estelle actively attempting to lure Garcin into a romantic entanglement, while Inez simultaneously directs her own seductive efforts toward Estelle. The moment the man and the young woman lean in for an embrace, the older woman adamantly refuses to avert her eyes, violently declaring her intention to scrutinize their every intimate interaction. Yet, you can observe that Garcin actually desires something far more profound from his female companion than mere physical affection. He eventually discloses the true nature of his execution, admitting that he was put to death for deserting his military duties, an agonizing failure that leaves him endlessly tormented by the lingering condemnation of his former colleagues. Ultimately, the former soldier desperately requires his companion to validate his courage, and she readily provides the empty reassurance he so deeply craves. However, Inez shatters the illusion with mocking laughter, pointing out to Garcin that the younger woman is merely appeasing him to secure masculine companionship. It becomes apparent that he suffers from the most profound manifestation of bad faith among the three, an affliction rooted entirely in his absolute refusal to take ownership of his past behavior. Lacking the internal fortitude to independently recognize his own worth, he requires external confirmation from his companion, eventually driving him into a state of intense revulsion that makes him yank the valet's bell and frantically batter the locked exit. He passionately shouts that he would gladly endure any agonizing physical punishment if only that impenetrable barrier would swing open. In a shocking twist, the door suddenly gives way. Yet, the supposedly eager escapee inexplicably freezes, entirely incapable of stepping across the threshold into the unknown. He finds it impossible to fathom an isolated existence where his female tormentor continues to evaluate him from afar without him knowing the exact nature of her critiques, prompting his choice to remain behind, to actively persuade her of his valor. Both he and Estelle persist as absolute captives of their earthly histories, continually gazing backward at the acquaintances they left behind, or desperately trying to validate their current state through the lens of bygone events. They remain stubbornly fixated on the echoing murmurs of the living, completely ignoring their own internal compasses in the present moment. Conversely, you will see how Inez perceives her previous life as an unreachable void, deliberately electing to root her consciousness firmly in the current reality. Even within the confines of this eternal prison, she vigorously claims her fundamental right to shape her own essence right now, boldly facing her own culpability and anguish to affirm her continued existence. As Sartre famously theorized, the sheer weight of personal liberty is so crushing that humanity is effectively condemned to be free, a philosophical concept perfectly illustrated by the deserter's pathetic refusal to exit his unlocked cell. Incapable of functioning without the critical observation of others to validate his history, the cowardly man essentially sentences himself to a perpetual, stagnant existence within those four walls. As he ultimately discovers, literal instruments of torture are entirely obsolete. It is the relentless scrutiny of the other that truly strips away and consumes his core identity. He is entirely paralyzed, unable to even share a simple kiss with his companion as long as their hostile observer keeps her eyes fixed upon them, falsely elevating her opinions into the sole legitimate evidence of his being. As the crushing reality of their inescapable shared eternity dawns on the trio, they erupt into a chorus of hysterical, unhinged laughter just as the performance concludes. In his final realization, he feels the heavy weight of those piercing stares fixated upon him, noting how they completely devour his spirit. He expresses genuine shock to you that his audience consists of merely two individuals, having expected a significantly larger mob of supernatural tormentors. The horrifying truth dawns on him that this mundane parlor is actually the underworld, a concept he previously found entirely unimaginable. You might recall all those ancient warnings regarding agonizing dungeons, apocalyptic flames, and the legendary burning marl, but he dismisses them all as foolish superstitions, delivering the iconic revelation that glowing iron rods are entirely redundant because true hell is simply other people.